Hello everyone, my name is Ben Eady, and I'm the online media manager of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled How the Business Analyst Can Align Agile Development with Business Priorities. Today's featured speakers are Derwin Harris and Steve Ghosh as a question moderator from Jama Software. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the question feature on the webinar software. I would also like to say thank you to Jama Software for sponsoring this event, and at this time I'll turn it over to Derwin and Steve to get us started.
So hello everybody and everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. So as you mentioned, today we'll be discussing how business analysts can align agile development with business priorities. Specifically, what I hope to demonstrate is how collaboration combined with traceability can enable you as business analysts to finally truly align these important concepts. So first, my name is Derwin Harris, and I'm a solutions architect and a co-founder here at Jama Software. Jama was founded based on the numerous experiences with projects attempting to adopt process and methodologies that would improve the overall experience, but also achieve the long sought after perfect balance between customer expectations and reality. Prior to Jama, I worked as a developer and as a consultant for an IBM business partner. This experience, as well as experiences I gain every day working with our customers here at Jama, has provided me a unique insight into how different companies are not only struggling, but how they are being successful. Moderating with me today is Steve Ghosh. Steve has 15 years experience as a developer, a business analyst, and a consultant, focused primarily on the insurance, banking, and healthcare industries at companies such as IBM, US Bank, ACS, and Fireman's Fund. He currently works as a technical account manager at Jama Software, focused primarily on deployment of customers' process and artifacts in Contour. So let's set the stage just a little bit for what I intend to talk about today. Per the webinar synopsis, we highlighted a couple of key questions. For example, what happens to the requirements? How can collaboration help me? And how will it help control scope? These are all valid points, but really only represent a few that come up in a typical project lifecycle. If we step back a bit, what is the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is to make sure that what we deliver is something we all agree on. It's not enough to say what the customer wants, because it's simply not always feasible to give them exactly what they want, nor is it guaranteed that they know what they want until we've gone through or seen something in action, which is really what Agile is all about. Within any project, there are many competing entities all working together, or at times against each other, towards some end goal. Who these entities are may differ, but the process is the same. Here I've generalized 4 key groups. Business, who could be the company building the solution or the vendor, the customer, who could be a stakeholder, but they are the folks with the money and ultimately the vision. And there is the development and the engineering who's building the actual product or solution. I've also included here this one section called reality, because there's always this element beyond our control that can guide the outcome. This can be as simple as an imminent deadline or a specific budget. It could also be more complex, such as an initial lack of understanding of the details that need to be further vetted out. From an Agile perspective, there may be Agile purists that state if we're not building what the customer wants, then we failed. But it's my opinion that the entire project is a partnership designed to not only build what the customer wants, but to help the customer understand what they want. This is subtle but important as we talk about business priorities and collaboration within the Agile concept. So what does this partnership really mean? If we look at where we start and what we have, the result can be a very different product at the end of the day. And this is actually okay. If we look at Agile and the process of taking one idea and moving to another idea as we evolve in that life cycle, we accept and understand change. That's really what Agile is all about. But what's really important is that where we were at the beginning of the project, everyone was in agreement on some vision, some plan. We want to make sure that when we get to that end of the project, at the end of the goal, that we're still in agreement with what we're delivering and what we're building. And really, Agile is about accomplishing this exact concept, because change is going to happen. And we want to make sure that when we get to the end of the project, that we're all still in alignment and we're all still in agreement. So let's review the Agile Manifesto a bit. The Agile Manifesto was put together to provide a guideline for a new approach. I say new, but really it was a culmination of ideas that had been brewing and implemented for several years. Even still, it has caused a lot of confusion over the last 10 years. It's important to look closely at the manifesto and will be something I refer back to often for the rest of this webinar. It provides us the background from which we'll build. So let's look at each line in detail, and I'll briefly describe what has resulted from them. Keep in mind, I'm drawing fairly broad generalizations here. So the first line, individuals and interactions over process and tools. Now, on some level, this has resulted in teams removing all existing tools and limiting process, though one can argue that a whiteboard is ultimately, in fact, a tool. Working software over comprehensive documentation. This is one of the more controversial, as it has resulted in folks claiming that there should be no documentation, when in fact the originators specifically stated this in a manner that allows documentation. There's a great video of Alistair Coburn talking about the evolution of these statements when they were first implemented back in 2001. And he used this as one example where they specifically recognized that documentation was still valid, though to a lesser degree. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. This one is really my favorite because, and probably the one I'll refer back to the most. But suffice it to say that while I totally agree, I do feel that negotiation is a necessary part of the process. The contract in this case is the vision and potentially the business priorities that help us manage expectations, scope, and budget. Responding to change over following a plan. Again, it is so true that change will happen, and learning to cope with this is key. But it should not override completely the plan, but should result in a change to the plan. As I mentioned, these assessments are based on my experiences and articles on the continued confusion over how best to implement Agile. But if we take a closer look, there's a quote at the bottom of the manifesto's website, and this is really key in my mind. That is, while there is value on the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. What this says to me is that the manifesto is not a call to revolt against the items on the right, but to shift focus to the items on the left. As I described moments ago, the two sides work in conjunction. So it's really more about finding the balance between the two. And this is at the crux of the confusion. Where is this balance? And sadly, I believe the answer is that it depends. So to reiterate and potentially make it clear, the manifesto does not read like this, using the term instead of between each statement. So the manifesto is really about moving focus from a traditional heavy flow to a more interactive, responsive approach. But how much is too much process or documentation? Is there a point where we are responding to change too much rather than following a plan? At one point, do the items on the left derail or overcomplicate the ability for a project to be successful? These are all difficult questions to ask. And again, the answer is going to differ between each project. One of my favorite books is The Crystal Clear by Alistair Coburn, who I mentioned before, who describes the process of being agile. In it, he focused on the idea that no project is the same, and that what is most important is the ability to be adaptive and to apply Agile in a manner that works within the organization or team. So for example, if you have a process in place and a set of documentation potentially already written, the worst thing you can do is to throw it all away. The key is to try new approaches and see how it works to respond accordingly to ensure a successful project. For example, one of the concepts I'll discuss today is how individuals and interactions can be enhanced through process and tools. And the customer collaboration would be complete chaos without some level of negotiation. So a successful project is the merging or balance of the two sides, of course with emphasis on the left side items. And it's this balance that will hopefully get us to the ultimate goal of a successful project that everyone agrees on. Hopefully this helps set the stage a bit from the perspective of Agile. We'll now look at a real example. Before we do that, I'd like to do a quick poll just to gather some feedback from everybody. So at this point, we'll do this poll. And the poll is really to gather, I think they're going to post up the poll for everyone to respond to. And what I'm really looking for is the degree that you're using Agile. Obviously, I could have provided more percentages, but the assumption is that if you say 50%, it means you're some level of hybrid. You're neither 0 nor 100%. Just going to check in with Ben. Are we putting the poll up there?
Yes, we had the poll up there, and we're just showing you the results here just right now. You won't be able to see it, but the audience will. Okay, so what we have here is, let's see, the first answer was 28%, second 50%, and third is 13%.
Great. Okay, that's very interesting, actually. So it's about what I expected. Typically, we see this a lot in the industry, that there's a hybrid approach to Agile, that you're either not using it at all, which is common. I'm actually surprised that there's people who are using it at 100% because, to be honest, I'm not even really sure what 100% agile means because it is this balance between these two worlds as I'm sort of describing here. But the fact that a majority of you are saying 50% is about what I would expect. I think that that's very common and acceptable to be at that kind of hybrid approach where you're utilizing both sides of the Agile Manifesto, which is sort of going back to that idea of balance. Cool. Shall I continue? So let's look at a real example. My goal today is really to demonstrate an example of a project that myself and Steve were both on. I'll highlight what worked, and I'll also highlight what didn't work. And ultimately, I want to use this as a springboard to better understand what we could have done to improve those things that didn't work. And really what we'll see how we used Agile, but how we could have used it better with this idea of business priorities. So to start, I'll warn you up front that the project had a lot of documentation. So already it may not feel very agile, but there are some nice surprises along the way. It's also worth noting that I've simplified many aspects of the project without losing the validity. Projects are complex, that's just the reality, and it's oftentimes difficult or necessary to show all of the nuts and bolts. So as you can see, in this project, we had a lot of standard type documentation. We had an RFP, we had requirements, we had use cases, and we had stories. Now the project itself was fairly sizable. It was a government agency, a state in this case, and the project was for a Medicare eligibility system. So I've really just focused on the key elements that were at play. But if we look at the flow of what took place, to start, the government agency, or the state in this case, sent out an RFP to a number of vendors. The vendors, which was us, responded with a document that defined our interpretation of the RFP, along with some detail around design, scope, and budget. This was the requirement specification. Theoretically, each requirement was mapped to one or more items in the RFP. During the process, we worked closely with the customer and did get many aspects of the company involved, from the executive teams down to the development. The customer accepted our bid, and we were essentially off and running. So from an agile perspective, there might have been some red flags at this point because a lot of work had been done upfront with no real working software, though I would say we had been very collaborative. We had business analysts involved, we had stakeholders involved. So on some level, you could say that this phase was done very agile and that we came to an agreement that everybody accepted. What happens downstream, though, is that the customer accepts the bid and we start building the product. But this is important because what the customer agreed to early on may have changed down the road. Now, what we did as a development team is that we were, again, very agile. We won the project and we began working with the stakeholders, but what you'll notice is there's a couple of different things that occurred here. We had more documentation, we were continuing to be agile in that we were developing stories, we were working in releases and we were working in sprints, and we were being very collaborative with the stakeholders. We had a stakeholder that we would provide working software to on an iterative basis. But that stakeholder may have been a different person than the stakeholder who was involved at the beginning of the RFP process. So there's this transition of information from one phase to another phase. So this is where that gap occurs, and this is part of the crux of the problem that we're trying to solve. Now, it's worth noting that overall, this project that I'm talking about was fairly successful. And I think part of that success was around our ability to be agile in the latter phase. And it was also really about the people that we were working with and how we all kind of worked well together. But gaps did occur. And you'll notice as well that I have in here the business priorities. But the business priorities, I've got a dotted line around because at this point in time in the project, they didn't really exist. We had no business priorities defined. And this was part of the problem because when we were down in the development cycle, we didn't have anything to really base a lot of our decisions on. So as we were finding changes in those iterative reviews with the stakeholders, we were making those changes on the fly, but we really had nothing to go back to ensure that those changes were still in alignment with either the RFP or even the business priorities. So we had nothing to really guide us in this process. And so what happens is that as we evolve and we end up at the time where the project is complete and everything's been successful, at least we think it's been successful, but what really occurred or what really happened here is that even though we might come to an end delivery and we think that we've successfully delivered a project, there was a lot of stress and a lot of strife that took place to get here. It was not an easy task. There was a lot of work, a lot of back and forth, a lot of documentation, a lot of conversations, many of which were redundant, that took place that could have otherwise been mitigated. And worse is that if we really went back and looked at the RFP, which they do an audit at the end of the day of the RFP and the end deliverable to understand whether or not we delivered what we said. And so the problem is that because the RFP is so far disconnected from the development that took place, it became out of date. It wasn't being updated as changes occurred. So it's not so much that change is bad, but that we need a way to bring this all the way back up to the RFP and make sure that that's either updated or we reprioritize what we're doing in development because it's not part of what the RFP originally designed. So this is really fundamental and at the core of the problem we're trying to solve. And the hope is that the business priorities will provide that. But this is not something that can easily be done just through documentation. So if we look at a typical project process, there are oftentimes gaps or cracks in the overall process where information is siloed or not visible, such as the RFP. The RFP took place at a stage and a phase that was far distant and far removed from the ultimate development and implementation. So as I mentioned in my example, we had a ton of documentation, but that documentation was also hard to find, it was outdated, and it wasn't directly linked to what was being worked on. So decisions and conversations were happening daily through different mediums that were instantly lost or had to be responded to in a second meeting, or you had hundreds of emails that were piling on top of that. So it's just very difficult to capture and track all of this information that's flying around. And of course, the project teams have their own tools and information, the prototype, bug tracking tools, testing, and yet even more documentation. But the key is that none of this is really connected all the way upstream or even downstream. But that's not to say that the right elements don't exist. We certainly had, in this example, highly skilled employees working on the project. For the most part, we had good stakeholder support, though they didn't always agree on the many rules. There were many, many meetings where we would provide them working software, and they would debate amongst themselves what really the rule or how it was interpreted. So there was a lot of work being done in the development cycle to understand what they wanted. So, and that's something that's difficult to do in the RFP process. We did have a defined development process, which is good, but it didn't span the entire organization, the entire process. Some of the problems that we had, and this is very common with most organizations, is that we had a distributed workforce. They were in many different locations, different geographical locations. But in addition, the project complexity was fairly high. As I mentioned, the rules and regulations around eligibility and Medicare, as you can imagine, is really complex. When we're dealing with government type requirements, there's a lot of ambiguity in there that needs to be understood and defined, and that's not something that can easily be done in the early stages. It's really going to have to be done when you get down into the working prototypes and see how things work. So this is where Agile becomes important. And lastly, obviously, we had changing requirements. And it's not bad to have changing requirements. It's just important that these changing requirements have an impact somewhere upstream or downstream. So if we look at this from a different perspective, I really like this graph because what it kind of highlights is something I was referencing it at before. That is, within a project, we always have data. Data is at the core of every single project. You're going to have requirements, stories, no matter what it is you're doing, even if they're up on Post-it notes, you're dealing with some kind of data. On top of that, we're putting process in place. And the process is an effort to manage that data, especially when that data becomes very large. So this is really important, and this is something that's been around for a long time. But I think one of the things that Agile has really been trying to highlight is this idea of people. The idea that in order to be successful in a project, in order to manage the data and the process, we have to make sure that the people are involved and that they're ultimately connected not only to themselves, but to the data. And this is really an underlying part of what I'm describing today, is that no matter the data or the process, it's ultimately the people and the ability for the people to adapt and communicate around the data that's going to make a project successful. So if we look at my example from the perspective of the people, just to give it another look, because I think it's important to note that ultimately when we're dealing with a project, we get caught up in this idea that it's documentation that we're trying to track and manage, but really it's about making sure that information, conversations, and things that are taking place amongst the team members is really what's driving this process along. So I've simplified this a bit. I've got stakeholders at the front, the product manager, the business analyst, and the developer. There's obviously a lot more people involved in this, but this is kind of a good breakdown because what you see is that when we look at that RFP process, that's really considered the business side of things, right? We've sat down with typically sales or account managers. The folks involved are really about determining what vendor they're going to go with. It's more focused on budget and scope. And yes, the RFP items are important, but it's more about which vendor is going to provide us the best solution at the lowest cost, whatever the case is. They just have different priorities around what they're building. And it's very different and separate from the technical side of things. Now, the technical folks might be involved on some level, but when you really get down into the development of the solution, a lot of things emerge and realizations are had and learnings taking place and changes occurring. And so these are very different approaches that are sadly separate, right, in terms of that process. We can also look at this from the perspective of plan versus build. Again, I think that when they talk about an agile, not wanting to avoid a plan and to focus more on collaboration and iteration, we can't ignore the fact that there has to be some kind of plan up front. There must be a vision. We simply don't have the freedom to just start building something without any kind of goals in mind. There must be some kind of plan. I don't know, or I don't see an easy way around this. So this plan is important. So the RFP is just a facts of life, and it exists. The build is very different. So we can see these, again, those two different lights, and hopefully that provides some clarity. And of course, underlying all of this is some kind of process. Now, this process may not be connected, it may be different, but ultimately there's some kind of process. Every organization has a series of steps that they go through to get from the RFP process down to the actual development and implementation process. And to what degree you use Agile or don't use Agile is really up to you. But it's just fundamental that there's going to be some kind of process involved. And along this process, there's oftentimes going to be tools in place. Now, Agile, again, sort of says tools are less important, but tools are really helpful and necessary to ensure that you're able to track and capture information, whether you're using email or an IM client or development tools for bug tracking, testing tools. These are all tools that are enabled or implemented to really help and facilitate the process. The trick, though, and one of the things I'm really highlighting, is that as you're using these tools, what's really important is the ability for them to be connected to the data and the artifacts and the people, which is what I was highlighting before. Because at the end of the day, we're always trying to answer this key question: what changed and why? And if the people and the data are not connected in some way, this becomes ever more complicated and hard to answer. People are running around trying to understand or define what's changed, and there's just too much work to go upstream to figure out how that impacts or to guide it based on priority. So let's take one last poll. This one's slightly different. Based on what I've talked about so far, what I'm interested in knowing is that as we look at a project, someone must be responsible for crossing that gap of providing that information across the different development teams to back to the RFP. And what role really in your mind should that be?
So what we have here trending so far is Business Analyst is trending at 62%, followed 22% for project managers and 10% for product managers. So we'll show that here. Just there you go. So yeah, the business analysts seem to be way out ahead of everybody else, followed by project managers.
Fantastic. I'm glad to see that. It means we've got the right people on the call. And it means that you definitely understand sort of your role in this process. I definitely could see product managers. And in fact, one thing that was really interesting to me is as I was doing a lot of interviews with business analysts, I found that a lot of companies, there's a lot of companies here in Portland, like Tripwire and those companies, they don't have business analysts. What they do have is product managers. But those product managers are business analysts. When you look at what they do on a day-to-day basis, I think it's not, you can think of a product manager as that one person, sort of like a product man or project manager, but there's a lot of companies that are just calling their business analysts product managers. At least that's what I've experienced. So I think that that could be a right answer as well. The project manager is interesting because it's typically one or two people, and to have that all in your head and to manage that is crazy, right? It's so much information, and this is where, and really fundamental to my question, is that what we're really trying to help you do is manage that information overload, and it can't just be one person who does that. And I think that's your biggest struggle today, is that you're being tasked with managing a ton of information across multiple people, multiple processes, and that's really the crux of the issue: is how do I manage this level of information? So great, thank you. Um, so if we look at this another way, there's this idea of drift. I don't know if you've heard this before. This is something we're kind of working on here at Jama, but this idea of drift is that it's okay. What's important is to ensure that we drift correctly and as efficiently as possible. In some respects, I believe that Agile allows for too much drift, right? If we simply ignore business priorities or the vision, then we can drift all over the place. And we ultimately need something to allow us or to help us manage the degree to which we drift or the efficiency to which we drift. So I guess at the end of the day, it's important that we end up at a place that we all agree, whether that's the new goals or the original goals, but getting there is really what's important. And this is something that happens through interactions and collaboration. But as I mentioned in that first slide, that fourth element, the reality is what's going to hopefully keep us in alignment. It's those constraints. It's the RFP. It's the business priorities that are helping us always have something to refer back to ensure that we're not drifting too far one way or too far another way. The big question that I'm sure you're all asking is, well, how do we do this? So it comes down to these two concepts, collaboration and traceability. And I think that these are really important ideas that we need to focus on. But it's not so much collaboration and traceability as independent notions, but they need to work together. So collaboration really as a term has been way overused. It's sort of unclear what it really means, but it's really important nonetheless. And we'll continue to use the word collaboration because it's important. But we need to sort of get at the root of what collaboration is and what it's all about, and how to manage collaboration. But it's not just about conversations. It's about the end result of collaboration, a decision, a milestone, a result of that. That's what's key. Traceability is important because it's what enables us to connect not only the people but the data. So really here at Jama, we see these two concepts as primary drivers for organizations who are seeking a tool or solution to help them manage the details of both. I would argue that while these two concepts are important, the two working together, as I've mentioned, is what's really going to give us the powerful ability to truly begin to recognize the long sought after holy grail of being more agile while working more seamlessly within a plan. So let's focus on collaboration. But I want to make a point before I dive into collaboration a little bit, is that agile and social really go together. You can use these terms sort of synonymously, because Agile is pushing for interactions and individuals, and collaboration is really about being social. The two kind of go together, and this is important as we talk about collaboration because it's really tying back to what it means to be agile. Again, agile itself is not a methodology. It's simply a balance between focuses, as we saw in the manifesto. So collaboration, let's look at what collaboration is. Collaboration comes in a lot of different forms. It might just be that we're working face-to-face in a whiteboard session. I know when I worked as a development team, we set up what they called the pit, where we all sat around a big table with all our computers, and if one person got sick, everybody got sick. So yeah, we were really able to collaborate, but it was just us as the developers and the business analysts sitting in a single room. The stakeholder was in a different state and could only visit on occasion. QA was in a different place. So it only goes so far, this capability to work face-to-face. And ultimately, when you're working face-to-face, how do you capture the decisions that you come up with? I've had a lot of conversations where we come to a conclusion and then it doesn't get captured somewhere. Of course, then there's email. We can collaborate all day long with email, and this is just simply proven over time that it's very ineffective. We continue to use it, but as a form of making decisions and doing reviews and getting feedback from folks, it's just way too complex. We could use IM or some other form of chat or Yammer, something to that effect, but that's, again, very quick little conversations and comments. It's not really designed to track answers or decisions. And then we get into the tools. And the tools themselves, there's tools out there that are emerging. And this is where I'll focus a lot of my time today. But regardless, when you look at collaboration, the end result is information overload. And this is what you as business analysts are probably suffering from on a day-to-day basis. And this is really, again, at the crux of the issue of being able to align Agile with the business priorities. In order to do that, you're trying to manage all this collaboration and information, and it's simply resulting in this information overload, causing confusion, stress, and ultimately project failure. But things are actually looking up. And so if we look at the timeline, it's really interesting to me to see what's happened in the last 10 years. So Agile was created back in 2001. And if you think back to 2001, the ideas of Agile were really around collaboration, individuals and interactions. It was way ahead of its time. But what's happened is that at that time, there was really nothing that we could do other than the whiteboard session. So every book that I read at the time were really promoting this idea of having the stakeholders on site, pair programming, extreme programming came up out of this. All these ideas of collaboration could only take place if everyone was in the same room. But again, that's only worthwhile if you have a project of 10 people and everybody really is in the same room. But even in that small project, it's easy to get off track, and you have to be able to track back to the business priorities, which are probably going to be posted up on the wall. But what's happened is that over the last few years, a couple of things have changed. It really wasn't until 2004 that Facebook came about. And so all of a sudden, there's this idea of being able to be social in a form that's very different than we were used to back in 2001. In fact, people are starting to change their patterns on how they're communicating. We've got people tweeting and doing Facebook and all the other means of social aspects that have really changed our lives in the last 10 years. And again, this did not exist in 2001. And then, of course, we started Contour in 2006, and then social business software was kind of coined by Jive in 2008, and SBS came out in 2010. So really, it's not until this latter part of the decade that we started to see solutions and tools emerging that was really embracing the business side of things. So if we look at this again, 2004, we kind of had this social revolution that took place. And then somewhere around 2008, 2010 to today, we're starting to see businesses embrace these social technologies. We're starting to see the people who are are coming out of high school and college and getting jobs, embracing these technologies. They're much more familiar with this ability to be social in a medium that's truly connecting them across platforms. And this just did not exist in 2001, and I think that's really important. So what is the big difference between social and business when it comes to this kind of collaboration? So the public sphere, and I'm just going to call it for today, is based on people, activities, likes, and similar topics or timelines like what Facebook's provided. But for business, it's very different. If we think back on that graph of the data, process, and people, all those things exist and are connected. So projects in business also have people, but it's different. It's slightly different in terms of how they interact. The big difference really is around what people are working on. For example, in business, the data could be documents or requirements or use cases, or it could be events such as releases or sprints or meetings that have taken place. But the big difference really between the social sphere and the business is really the traceability. There isn't a need in Facebook to link or trace to actual objects other than just the people. It's much more complex in a business environment. So if we focus for a moment on traceability, and then I'll kind of bring the two together, and it will really show us kind of where we're going with this whole business priorities. So traceability at its core is really about linking data together. I know all of you are very familiar with traceability, but the big question is, how granular do you get with that traceability? And it's my philosophy that it should be down to the item that's ultimately impacted. And I see this at every organization. They're ultimately linking their requirements with their non-functional requirements, or they're linking to the stories and the test cases. So traceability is fundamental in project success. The big difference, in my opinion, is that traceability isn't enough. It's not just about the data, it's about the people, right? And it's about the conversations that are happening around those links or those items. The changes not only to the data, but to the items. Now, I imagine some of you might still be doing traceability in Excel. That is incredibly, in my mind, error prone, and it doesn't allow for the conversations to really be tracked. So with collaboration, we can now see the conversations that affect not only other people, but the data. And in fact, the data can and will guide the conversation. So one thing I like to say is that sometimes the decisional comments on a requirement are more important than the requirement itself. At least it provides a lot of context and insight that might have been missed. In my project example, in the example I've been using before, this information was completely missing. So there's no easy way to stay in alignment with information upstream or downstream. Had we had something that allowed us to see the conversations and decisions, we would have been able to improve our overall efficiency and quality. So where does this bring us today? All of this is really possible today, albeit it's using tools. Despite what Agile says, this kind of collaboration cannot be done using traditional means, unless you're a very small team all in the exact same room. But as you get into more complex projects and more widely distributed workforces, you simply cannot accomplish this using those means. So it's important, but the key thing is that we have the tools and the capabilities today. And the reason I think this is because a couple reasons. People are more social than ever. As I mentioned, we have all of these people coming out of the schools, and they get social. We see adults now working with it a lot. It's just out there. We're all becoming very comfortable with this. We're very more comfortable with the tools, the ability to socialize and to do decision making inside of an environment like that. Again, I'll mention the social concept did not exist when Agile started, and I think that's important to remember because we've come a long way. And lastly, traceability continues to be key, but it really should be used in conjunction with collaboration. So essentially, all of these concepts have all converged literally in the last couple of years and continue to converge and mature. And even though I've got Jama at the center for some selfless promotion, the key message here is that to achieve the kind of collaboration and traceability to the business requirements, you cannot expect to do this effectively with Excel or simply a whiteboard. So where does this leave you in my original example? Well, over the last 10 years, you've been told to collaborate more and to act as a liaison between the stakeholders and development. If we look back at that poll we just took, we proved exactly that case. You've been asked to act as this liaison, bringing information back and forth, and that's become very complex. And in my opinion, you'll go insane trying to manage the level of information that is passed back and forth in a typical project without tools and process. And lastly, now really is the time. Until recently, you do not have many options and we're asked to do a lot of manual legwork. So if we look back at the example with what we've learned, how could the project have been different? The RFP process simply is not going to go away. We can't simply respond to an RFP with a note saying, choose us and we'll deliver what you want using Agile. We have to come up with some kind of vision and plan. It's just that's the way it works. Further downstream, the development team did fairly well considering the information provided. They were able to give the customers a working prototype to help facilitate decisions. At the top, if we had some business priorities that had been created during the RFP process, those priorities would not only help the development understand better what to do, but to also steer the conversations discovered, the conversations in general. But the business priorities will not suffice alone. They must, in a sense, live and always be present. They must be part of the overall process. So if we look at this from a different perspective, had we had business priorities, a lot of things would have been solved. One of the things, or one of the stories that I like to tell, is that in the development side of things, we were asked, or the development team raised the red flag that there was no way they were going to be able to deliver what they were being asked to deliver in the time they were being asked to deliver. And so the product team said, well, why don't you guys go spend a day and figure out what it is you think you can deliver? Well, the dev team did that. They went off site and spent the day looking through all of the use cases and determining what they felt they could implement. But when they came back and presented what they thought they could implement within the time frame, they had completely missed the business priorities and the importance of certain elements. So for example, eligibility was the most complex of the modules that they had to build. And they simply said, well, we'll just not do eligibility, but that simply wasn't possible. And had they had some level of business priorities, they would have known that. They could have used that to better determine, okay, well, the top business priority is this, and so therefore we can use that to better define. So it's things like that that really would have enabled us to be more efficient in the overall process. Always track back to not only the business priorities, but to the RFP, so at the end of the day, everything's in alignment. So let's summarize what we've gone through here. Basically, we've talked about how Agile has really come around since 2001, and it's ultimately helped teams be smarter. Agile has been successful, there's no question. The idea of people being more collaborative, the whole idea of being iterative, these concepts have really helped teams be more successful. In my example, it helped us be successful. We were Agile as a development team, we were Agile in the RFP process. It did help us be successful, but it could have been done better. And in light of that, a lot has happened in the last 11 years. So the project I'm describing was about 8 years ago, and none of these tools were really in place. We didn't have the capabilities to do it. We used what we had at that time. But since so much has changed, we now have those capabilities. Collaboration itself needs good tools. You cannot do collaboration through documents or emails or just purely through face-to-face. All those things are good meetings, but it's all got to be brought together. Traceability itself also needs good tools. It, as well, can't be done just purely by linking things in an Excel sheet. They need to be linked physically and in reality so we can really see the information. And there's lots of tools out there that are doing this today, including Collaboration and traceability should also be considered together to truly realize Agile. I really believe this. I believe that Agile is an important concept, but to be collaborative and to allow for those interactions is best managed or helped through good tools. And this is, I think this may be somewhat controversial, but I think it's important nonetheless. And lastly, the business needs, business priorities are really going to help teams continually be iterative and better manage the balance of Agile. So if we go all the way back to the original slide, what I was really showing was that Agile is about a balance between the left and the right, with emphasis on those items on the left. And so there's room for business priorities to be in place to help us avoid the drift going too far throughout the process. And so this is really the fundamental reason for today's webinar, and I hope that what I've described or brought up in here is helpful and resonates with you and your ability to better manage and track the information across the project. And with that, we are now at the Q&A with about 15 minutes to spare.
Steve, got a few questions that have come through here.
Sure.
First one that's come up a couple times is kind of a little bit of confusion or question around what's the difference really between scope drift or scope creep and drift, and how that slide kind of shows that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that drift's somewhat of a generic term, but scope creep is a great term, right? Because scope creep has this sort of negative connotation that we're creeping away from the original scope. I think that's fundamental in what we're talking about here. Scope creep or changing requirements is going to happen. Just like in my slide with the drift is going to happen. The question really is, are we okay with that? And is the scope that's changing, that creep part of the scope, in agreement with what the customer wants and what the vendor or the person building it wants? I think that's important to realize. We can't just simply build whatever the customer wants. We all recognize that there's a scope that's been defined, budget in place, there's a timeline. And so if we've recognized the change, let's say the customer, let's say the example I've used before, the customer is looking at what we provide and they go, oh, the rule around eligibility must include additional or the income level of the spouse as well. I forgot about that early on, but it's got to include the spouse as well. Well, that's essentially scope creep, but it's necessary and important to get it in there because it's worthless without. Like if we look back at the business priorities or at the RFP, we would see that it must succeed in accomplishing eligibility. Maybe it's as broad as that, and without that, we don't have anything to subtract to. So hopefully that's helping answer the question. You got anything to add to that, Steve, or are there other questions?
No, and I think I've kind of a similar thing where scope creep tends to be undiscovered or additional requirements that find their way into the project that weren't originally part of the agreement, and that drift can be the fact that 6 months, 12 months, 18 months pass. The discussions around those requirements and what they're building maybe wander off a little bit from what they originally meant, and so both pieces where coming back to that traceability standpoint where you go back and you have that original agreement in front of you all the time, and that requirement exists, it needs to be tied to something. And so very similar. Both of them are going to take you off track, but I think a little bit different ways of getting. There's been just some questions too on a little bit on just kind of the nuts and bolts of the project and in your example, and really how did the requirements relate to the use cases, relate to the stories, and what was the approach there?
That's a great question, actually. And again, the funny thing about that is that I've seen it done differently at different organizations. So as an example, the example I used here in the presentation, the requirements came first. The requirements were in response to the RFP. And so they came first and they existed first. So a lot of organizations have a set of requirements that they must build from. And so those requirements are then derived either directly into use cases, which is a little more traditional. Some organizations are going directly into stories at this point. How are we going to implement or deliver the requirements? I think the requirements are important and not to be forgotten because they do represent a contract. It's much easier to agree on a requirement than it is a story. A story has a lot of additional granular detail in it that needs to be implemented. So, but that traceability is important to be able to say, well, how did we implement this requirement? And to make sure that all the requirements are in fact implement. I mean, that's the key of traceability. I've also seen where, I've only seen this a couple times, but I found it interesting. One company was telling me that they actually build the stories first, or they actually do epics and stories, and they kind of come up with what features they're going to have, and they work with the customer on that, and then they build the requirements out of that. Because again, it's hard to get sign-off on a bunch of stories that are defined in sprints, but it's much easier to get signed off on requirements. They're just designed statement-wise to be something that we can contractually all agree on. The system must do X. These are simple requirements, and so they actually backwards create requirements so that they have something that they can work with from a contractual point. So I know that Agile says over contracts, but again, it's this balance. Right? Does that make sense? Anything to add?
No, I think that is, and actually this is maybe a good lead-in to the next question here. Do all the participants in a project have to understand Agile? I think that's where that business analyst role really is bridging the two worlds. That the business team's not necessarily going to want to deal with 1,000 stories of bite-sized little pieces of functionality. They want to think about the broader picture and how they would work through the system. And so being able to be a business analyst, playing the product owner role in an Agile project, you're able to, I don't know if shield is the correct word, but you're able to maybe not inflict the process on the business as much as I think a lot of projects do nowadays, where that is a big role is the development team has a new process, and suddenly everyone in the organization now has to conform to that and put their pieces in there. And so I think through the presentation here, one of the key factors has been that each world can have the documentation that it needs, and through the traceability and through the collaboration, you're able to manage both worlds.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it also kind of goes back to what is Agile, right? I think that's why I brought up the manifesto in the very beginning, because it's really just guidelines, right? So to question whether the whole team should understand Agile, I think that sort of goes in line with kind of what's happened in the last 10 years. Is there's this sense, or even this little bit of fear, that because the development team is implementing Agile as a noun, right? That they've gone Agile, so they've got stories and they're changing the way things work. It doesn't eliminate the need for the things on the right, right? I think that's the key. And as we move upstream into the business, those things on the right become a little more important, but they can't be forgotten as we go all the way downstream. So there is this idea that all aspects of the company should understand Agile and maybe sort of how it helps them be better. I mean, for the whole organization to be more collaborative is going to benefit as long as that collaboration is done in a way that's not overwhelming, right? If you're just having meetings every single day, all day long, you're not going to get anywhere. So it's about managing those interactions and those collaborations, but also avoiding those silos that documentation has created in the past. And that's really what Agile is about, is let's get out of those silos of people working on specific documents sort of heads down without any interaction or constant iterative interaction. And that happens at all levels. So I think there's somewhat of a misunderstanding of what Agile is, because the development team has embraced it so much that it's become this development team thing. But it really can be a organization-wide thing.
And I've got a question here as well as, how do you trace these social interactions? How do we trace the whiteboard conversations and the different things that are going on as this Agile process goes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the whiteboard sessions are probably the most, right now we do a lot of things where we're taking photos of the whiteboard session. And what's nice about that is that you can post it on, because I'm familiar and we use Contour, if we do a whiteboard session or we do a sprint review on a release, we'll take the comments and questions and things that came up, in that meeting along with a picture of the whiteboard and post it onto Contour and then link it to whatever feature we're working on. So in that sense, not only are you providing visibility to what the conversation was, but you're linking it to the data type that you're dealing with. And so then other individuals in the organization who maybe weren't privy or ability to go into that meeting can then come in and comment on it, add their own comments, and have the ability to do reviews and approvals and things like that. But that's really why I've kind of been emphasizing the tool concept of things, because that's difficult to do, right? If you use traditional means, if you took a photo of the whiteboard, even the iPhone didn't exist back in 2001, so you'd have to take like a photo and get it developed back in 2001 for Agile, and then post it on email, and that right away gets lost. So really is about having a central location.
Yeah, and I think we just have a couple minutes left, but something that has come up here a few times, and you talked about Contour, but the question is, what is Jama? And so I don't know if that'd be helpful, kind of last question here.
Yeah, so Jama Software is a company, and we have one product called Contour, and I'll just go to this last slide, is our philosophy is leverage your collective genius. And in fact, I'm actually in the middle of reading this book called Too Big to Know. And it's a great book because it's describing this idea of information overload. That you have the internet with all these links and information all over the place, but it's not so much an information problem as much as it's a filtering problem. So when we think about projects and the kind of information that exists, data-wise and people-wise, it's our goal through Contour to provide a solution that's really connecting things together. And this is really a trend we're seeing. So obviously this is our belief, and that's sort of what it's all about. So Jama Software is the company, Contour is the product, and it's really about connecting people and data through traceability and collaboration.
Excellent. Well, thank you, guys. I got one quick last question is, could you repeat the book you just referenced by Mark here, and then I'll close things off.
Yes, the book is called Too Big to Know, and I apologize, I don't know the author, but I can find that out very quickly.
Okay, thank you, Derwin and Steve, for a very informative presentation, and thank you to everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. And this concludes today's event. We hope you have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.